Good day, everyone. So I was listening to the Keqinq Main's Roundtable podcast. If you haven't watched it, you can look at it. But I was mostly interested in what they had to say about Nilou. And obviously, they've said a lot of things that is kind of wrong, and that's what we'll cover in this video. But there was one thing that they did say, which was at least right. And I kind of said this already 2 weeks ago. So do note that this was on 1 Feb. So just have a quick listen.
I think she has a lot of flavor as a unit.
Right, so you heard that. She has a lot of flavor as a unit, and listen to what I said on the 20th of January. Nilou teams, or Nilou Bloom teams, are now coming in different flavors. So there you go. It's pretty much the one thing I agree with, is because I already said it. But everything else that they've kind of put here was completely wrong. So let's just quickly go over some of the things that they've kind of said, and hopefully you guys will realize just how much depth there was lacking in the things that they kind of put out. So this is my problem with everything that they got wrong on Nilou. This idea that she got better after Nahida, and for me personally, it's one of those sentiments that just like irritates me because it ignores how much potential she brings out of free units like Barbara, Kole, and the Dendro sort of Traveler, and the fact that people could still get, even with a C0 Nilou and using this teams, 9 stars in the Spiral Abyss. People have still done it. Someone even shared a clip the other day with me. And also this idea that she was nothing without Kokomi, and this is a bizarre idea that a lot of people keep putting forward, especially with Yaoyao. They're like, oh, well, what happens if someone doesn't have Kokomi? And it's just like, well, Kokomi had 3 banners in her entire history, and I'm just like, seriously? But someone might say, but look, what about the new player perspective, which is kind of what they were also hopping on. But I think that's kind of a stupid perspective, because if you're a new player, you don't care about in-game meta due to your account not even being able to tackle like the Spiral Abyss, resin gating, artifact farming, and at which point, if you do get as a new player to that point, you will eventually have a Nahida or Kokomi rerun, and you'll have other, let's say, new units that you can also pick up to make your Nilou better. So a lot of these little perspectives that they put out is kind of bad. I think Nilou herself was perfectly functional, perfectly usable without Nahida, and the way in which she did it was just like so good. Yes, of course, with Nahida she became a top tier unit in terms of the meta and so on, but so has some of the other like little spread teams that we've seen. Like I've seen the sort of speedruns with Yaimiko and Technery. They're just absolutely crazy, but that's what Nahida enables. It's not just that Nilou got better, a lot of teams got better, so I feel like that's a very moot point. The other big thing that they kind of made, of like big point I tried to make in a little podcast, was the fact that a Dendro healer will make her better, and now we have one. And from a top meta perspective, which is arguably what the Keqinq main should be about, Yaoyao is really not the best. And like I said in my little video right here, has, Yaoyao replaced Kokomi? Obviously not. What Yaoyao enables is just more varieties of Nilou teams, but you certainly did not need a Dendro healer. And in fact, one of the things that the guys did not really understand was that Yaoyao is actually superseded by Kole, especially in the AoE teams, due to the on-field versus off-field Dendro core production. We've covered this on the channel before. If anything, one of the things that I felt that the guys did not even speak about is Nilou's single target potential, and this is arguably what Yaoyao really enables if you run Qingshu Yelon instead of Kokomi. In an AoE, Yaoyao is not that great, but you can still get your 9 stars as an F2P. It's still workable, but you're not going to be setting clear times for an F2P or at a well level with using Yaoyao whatsoever. So for me, this idea that suddenly Nilou is like really good with Yao, it's just, I think that's like very overinflated. It does speak to the lack of practical experience that the guys have. A lot of the guys also mentioned that they don't like the restriction. In other words, you don't like the bountiful cores being restricted, because nothing stops you from playing Nilou for Hydro in other teams, even meme teams like we've sort of shown on the channel before. And here's the thing, even if a bountiful course did work outside the restriction, you'd find that it doesn't work with Hyperbloom units since they can't trigger it. So now Nilou stole all the cores for like Hyperbloom, so your Hyperbloom teams just don't work. Grouping up with an enemy unit is less useful since you're still restricted to 2 hits per enemy, and she's got a wide AoE. And the other problem that I've also have is that if you put in other units, and assuming bountiful core works, you now have problems with your Dendro and Hydra applications, leading to subpar results, because you now put in a pyro unit, well, that kind of messes up stuff. If you put like in a cryo unit, probably the best sort of situation, you'll definitely lag in terms of your production because you don't have enough to sort of apply and get those quick little cores to explode every 0.5 seconds. So you would probably just naturally go back to 2 Dendro 2 Hydro, 1 Dendro 3 Hydro. I don't think the guys, and like I put here, thought this through from a really practical or an elemental gauge theory perspective. The restriction on the bountiful cores is genuinely not that bad. In fact, I think if there was no restriction, you'd probably have to tone down it a bit to enable her to work in more teams, but just for like balancing purposes. But then you sort of start losing the identity of Nilou, which is kind of bad. My other thing is I had like a bit of a bone to pick here with the chef because he said she is pretty much crap without the other units, and for me that is again false because we know that a lot of F2P players on YouTube have proven that you don't need Nahida, you don't need Kokomi, you can still beat it. This is the key thing for me. Her restriction enabled more F2P units than most other 5-star characters would. I think the only other sort of character you could probably argue is perhaps like Kazuha and so on. And I must say there is something to be said here about the niche of characters like Xiangling and some others that require other very specific units, but let's not go too much into that because that might just sort of rub them the wrong way. But certainly I'm always told Hu Tao with double hydro and some sort of shield. I'm always told that certain units need to be played in certain ways. I need Farazan for Wanderer, I need this for this type of, it's just like there are many teams that have restrictions before they become much more useful. And I feel that even though Nilou has got this Dendro Hydro restriction at its lower level, she's much more useful than a lot of these other teams, especially like Xiangling teams. If you take away Bennett, it's just like, well, what are you then going to run? Well, it's Sukokomon, but then how many people can practically play that very, very well? Very, very few. Certainly not any one of the little geniuses on this podcast. And yeah, these are just like kind of my final thoughts. I thought that they ignored a lot of the intricacies of a kit. The focus was a lot on her restriction, and they don't understand stuff like you can choose how you wish to do your Hydra application on Nilou. We spoke about this, the whole ring versus the sword sort of effect, the amount of EM sharing from the team itself. I think the whole it's expensive to build argument is kind of really oversold because it's not really that expensive to build once you take into account like all the different ways you can actually build up its entire team's EM. Certainly there's an argument recently that Kokomi does not need the EM, and I certainly agree. I also think there's a lot of nuance that they lost in terms of exactly how asynchronous Nilou's rotations are and the flexibility that that provides her in multiple like different situations. I think the only big problem for Nilou sort of teams is if your enemy has a continuous or pyro aura on it, or like a cryo aura on it. That's certainly where she does kind of fall a bit apart. And then also, yeah, finally, I think the guys never even spoke about exactly how useful her team's abilities, her team is in terms of just using abilities like her normal and E above using expensive burst, and how effective you can still be. I think overall for Fury Crafters, they said very little of practical value and more so trying to say, yeah, she's good, but let's kind of just keep on bashing the character. Certainly a very poor sort of round, sort of like podcast from these guys. It's yeah. I do expect more from them. I do expect more technical detail because that's why people want to watch it. They want to find out something that they would not have thought about. But if it's just going to be a round table and people sort of reiterating the same sort of crap without actually having played the units, then it is kind of irritating. Now, I understand that not everyone here on their team might have had Nilou, not all of them wanted Nilou, but for God's sake, if you're going to talk about Nilou, just bring in one person that has the practical experience, that has done the Fury crafting on it, because what was shown here was just abysmal. Alright, thanks for watching. Cheers.